The storm that changed everything. The snow fell in relentless waves, thick and blinding, swallowing the road ahead in a never-ending white abyss. The wipers of the luxury sedan barely kept up with the storm, streaking moisture across the windshield as the headlights fought to pierce the darkness. Eleanor Whitmore gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. Her breath came in uneven bursts, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. She wasn't just running from the storm outside. She was running from the storm inside her own life. The betrayal still burned in her veins like acid. Her husband, her business partner, the two people she had trusted most in the world, conspiring behind her back. "I love you, Elle," but his voice still echoed in her head, smooth and practiced, like he had been rehearsing those words for months. The love was a lie. The concern was a lie. The years she had spent sacrificing for their future, worthless. And the worst part, he hadn't just betrayed her personally. He had schemed to take her company, the empire she had built from the ground up. Eleanor's chest tightened as she forced herself to focus on the road. The storm raged on, turning the world into a frozen nightmare, but she kept driving. She had to. She needed to get away. She needed to escape the suffocating weight of everything crashing down around her. A sign flashed past on the side of the road. Warning: hazardous weather conditions ahead. Travel discouraged. She ignored it. The tires struggled against the slick pavement, the traction control light flickering on the dashboard. The road was turning into an ice rink beneath her, but still, she pressed harder on the gas. Then it happened. The sedan hit a patch of black ice. Eleanor felt the world shift beneath her as the tires lost grip. The car spun violently, her body jerking as she fought to regain control. The headlights swung wildly, illuminating the trees lining the highway before everything tilted, and suddenly she was airborne. A sickening crunch filled the air. The force of impact slammed her forward as the car veered off the road and into the snow-covered ditch. The windshield spiderwebbed with fractures. The seatbelt cut into her chest. Metal groaned as the weight of the crash settled. And then, nothing. Silence. Eleanor gasped, blinking through the daze of impact. Pain throbbed at her temple, warmth trickling down the side of her face. Her breaths were shaky, uneven. She tried to move, but her body protested, muscles stiff from the shock. Outside, the snowstorm roared on, howling through the trees like a living thing. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, but when she pulled it from the console, the screen remained black. No signal, no power, no way out. A wave of panic surged through her. She was alone, in the middle of nowhere, trapped in a storm that showed no signs of relenting. If she didn't get out soon, she swallowed hard. Think, Eleanor. Think. But before she could force herself to move, she heard it. Footsteps. Crunch. Crunch. Someone was coming. A shadow loomed through the blizzard, tall and broad, moving with deliberate purpose. Eleanor's pulse spiked. The figure reached the car, yanking at the driver's side door with enough force to shake the frame. "Damn it," a deep voice muttered. The door groaned as it was wrenched open, and Eleanor barely had time to register the freezing wind before strong arms reached in, wrapping around her. "What the?" she gasped, struggling weakly as she was pulled from the wreckage. "Stop moving," the voice commanded, firm but not unkind. Eleanor barely registered the cold as her head lolled against the stranger's shoulder. He smelled like pine and wood smoke, his warmth a stark contrast to the frozen world around them. "Got you," he murmured. And then, everything went dark. The cabin in the storm. The first thing Eleanor felt was heat. Warmth, seeping into her bones, chasing away the numbing chill that had settled deep inside her. She shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against something soft. Thick blankets, heavy and comforting. Her eyelids fluttered open, vision hazy. The room around her was dimly lit, the flickering glow of a fireplace casting golden shadows across rough wooden walls. Not a hospital. Not a hotel. Not anywhere she recognized. She bolted upright, her body protesting the sudden movement as pain flared in her ribs. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. "Don't move too fast." The deep voice came from across the room. Eleanor's heart lurched as she turned toward the sound. A man sat in a worn leather chair near the fire, arms resting on the wooden table beside him. His posture was relaxed, but there was an undeniable presence about him, like a predator watching its surroundings. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a thermal Henley and dark flannel. His hair was slightly disheveled, dark stubble lining the strong jaw. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Stormy gray, sharp and unreadable. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice raspier than she intended. The man didn't flinch. Caleb Mercer. Eleanor swallowed hard, glancing down at herself. She was wrapped in a thick sweater, definitely not hers. She pulled the fabric closer instinctively. "Where am I?" she asked. "My cabin," Caleb replied. "You crashed on the highway. If I hadn't pulled you out, you wouldn't have made it." Her pulse quickened. "How far from the main road?" 20 miles. Her stomach dropped. 20 miles. "You're joking." Caleb leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Do I look like I joke much?" Eleanor's eyes darted to the window, but all she saw was white. The blizzard was still raging, the wind rattling against the wooden walls. No escape. Her gaze snapped back to Caleb. "I need my phone." He nodded toward the small table beside the fireplace. "Dead." She grabbed it, pressing the power button. Nothing. "Charger?" she asked. Caleb smirked, slow and dry. "Do I look like I keep chargers lying around?" Eleanor scowled. "Oh great, stranded in the middle of nowhere with a mountain man who lives like it's the 1800s. That almost earned her a real smirk, but it faded as quickly as it appeared. "You should get some rest," Caleb said instead. Eleanor exhaled sharply, gripping the phone in her palm. "So, what, I'm just supposed to sit here and wait?" Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Pretty much." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor let her eyes wander around the cabin. The rustic furniture, the stacked books, the modest kitchen. It wasn't much, but it felt lived in. Finally, she turned back to him. "Okay, if I'm stuck here, at least tell me one thing." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "What's that?" She met his gaze. "Why the hell do you live out here alone?" For the first time, something flickered in his storm-gray eyes, but instead of answering, he looked away. "That," he said simply, "is none of your business." And with that, the storm raged on outside, trapping them both in a place neither of them belonged. Trapped in the wilderness. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls of the cabin. Eleanor sat curled up on the couch, the thick blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her mind racing even as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. The warmth of the cabin should have been comforting, a welcome contrast to the freezing cold outside, but instead it only made her feel more trapped. Caleb Mercer, the man who had pulled her from the wreckage, saved her from freezing to death in the middle of a relentless blizzard, and now refused to answer a single damn question. He sat across from her, a book in his hand, though he hadn't turned a page in minutes. He was staring at the fire, his expression unreadable, his jaw clenched slightly as if deep in thought. Eleanor shifted on the couch, still feeling the dull ache in her ribs from the crash. She wasn't the type to sit still and accept things. She needed control, answers, and a plan. But right now, she had nothing. No phone. No way to call for help. No idea how long she'd be stuck here with this mountain man. Her gaze flickered over to him again, studying his features in the firelight. He was rugged, in a way that spoke of years of hard labor, of survival. The sleeves of his flannel were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle. His hands, resting on the arms of the chair, were rough and calloused. Hands of a man who built, who worked, who endured. He was nothing like the polished, arrogant businessman she was used to dealing with in New York. Caleb must have sensed her staring because he finally spoke without looking up. "You keep staring at me like that, and I'm gonna start thinking you're planning something." Eleanor rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't flatter yourself. I'm just trying to figure out why someone would choose to live out here in the middle of nowhere, completely off the grid." Caleb finally turned his gaze toward her, those gray eyes sharp and assessing. "You don't have to figure me out. I don't like mysteries," she shot back. His lips twitched, just barely. "Well, that's unfortunate." Eleanor huffed, shifting again. The couch was comfortable, but the tension in the room was not. She needed something, anything, to distract herself. She glanced toward the small kitchen area. There wasn't much, just a simple wooden counter, a few shelves, and a stove that looked older than she was. But there were supplies. She stood abruptly, throwing the blanket off. Caleb arched a brow. "What are you doing?" "I'm making tea," she said, marching toward the kitchen. "Or coffee. Whatever you have." Caleb sighed, setting his book down. "You don't have to do that." "Well, I'm not just going to sit here and stare at the walls," she said, opening cabinets. "I need something to do before I lose my mind." She found a tin of loose-leaf tea, a mug, and a kettle. The water pump at the sink groaned when she turned it on, but after a few seconds, it sputtered out a slow stream of water. She filled the kettle and placed it on the stove. Caleb watched her with mild amusement. "You always this stubborn." Eleanor shot him a look. "You have no idea." A low chuckle escaped him. And for a brief moment, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. It wasn't quite friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. Eleanor let out a slow breath, leaning against the counter as she waited for the water to heat. "So, what do you do out here?" "Chop wood, hunt bears, talk to squirrels." Caleb smirked. "Something like that." She scoffed. "You're impossible. You're impatient." "Because I have a life to get back to." Something dark flickered in Caleb's gaze, just for a second, before he looked away. "Yeah. And what kind of life is that?" Eleanor stiffened. She knew what he was getting at. Her perfect, polished life in New York had already crumbled. Her husband's betrayal, her best friend's deception, her company, the empire she had built, slipping through her fingers like sand. Her throat tightened. She turned back to the stove, pretending to check the kettle. "It's none of your business," she muttered. Caleb let out a slow breath. Fair enough. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. The storm still raged outside, the wind howling against the cabin walls, shaking the windows. When the kettle finally whistled, Eleanor grabbed a mug and poured the steaming water over the tea leaves, inhaling the warmth of the scent. She hesitated for a moment. Then, without looking at him, she poured a second cup and set it on the table in front of Caleb. He looked at it, then at her. She crossed her arms. "Don't read too much into it. I just figured you drink something other than whiskey." Caleb snorted but picked up the mug, taking a slow sip. "You don't seem like the kind of woman who drinks tea." "I don't," she admitted. "I usually drink overpriced coffee made by baristas who hate their job. But I'm improvising." Caleb smirked. Impressive. Eleanor rolled her eyes, but there was no real annoyance behind it. For a few minutes, they sat in a rare, comfortable silence, both sipping their tea while the storm raged on outside. Then suddenly, there was a sound, a loud baying outside the cabin. Eleanor's heart lurched. She jolted upright, eyes wide. What the hell was that? Caleb was already moving, setting his mug down and striding toward the door. He grabbed a heavy coat from the hook near the entrance and pulled on a pair of boots. "Stay here," he said firmly. Eleanor scowled. "Like hell I will." He shot her a look that made her pause. "I mean it." Something in his voice made her hesitate. This wasn't a joke. She swallowed hard as he opened the door, stepping out into the blizzard. The wind immediately blasted inside, sending a rush of icy air through the cabin. Then the door shut behind him, and he was gone. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She had no idea what was out there. But something in Caleb's reaction told her one thing for sure. It wasn't good. Shadows in the snow. The wind howled like a living thing outside the cabin, rattling the windows as Eleanor stood frozen near the fireplace, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Caleb had disappeared into the storm, his massive frame swallowed by the blinding snowfall, the moment the door shut behind him. The bang outside hadn't been thunder. It had been something else, something that made Caleb react instantly, without hesitation. Eleanor's mind raced. Could it be an animal? A falling tree? Or something worse? She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. The warmth of the tea she had just made was still on her tongue, but the moment of peace had shattered like fragile glass. She turned toward the window, squinting through the frost-covered panes. Nothing. Just an endless sea of white, swirling and shifting in the wind, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. Her hands curled into the thick sweater she wore, Caleb's sweater. She had woken up wrapped in it, warm despite the freezing temperatures outside. The thought sent a strange warmth through her chest, but she shoved it aside. Now was not the time. Minutes passed. The storm roared, and Caleb still hadn't come back. Panic started to rise inside her. What if something happened to him? She bit her lip, shifting from foot to foot, trying to fight the growing unease in her gut. This was not her world. She wasn't a survivalist. She wasn't built for this. Back in New York, if something went wrong, she made a phone call, sent an email, hired someone to fix it. But here, she was helpless. And she hated it. Finally, she had enough. She wasn't going to sit here, wrapped up in a damn blanket, waiting for something bad to happen. Determination surged through her as she grabbed the heavy coat draped over a chair and shoved her arms into it. The fabric was thick, a little too big for her, but warm. She didn't care. She yanked the zipper up and grabbed the closest pair of boots, Caleb's, before pulling them on. They were way too big, but they would have to do. She took a deep breath and marched toward the door. This is stupid. You have no idea what's out there. But neither did Caleb. And she refused to sit here, doing nothing. With one last deep breath, she yanked the door open and stepped outside. Into the blizzard. The cold was instant, a brutal, unforgiving force that slammed into her the moment she stepped off the wooden porch. The wind whipped against her face, biting into her skin like tiny daggers. Snow pelted down in thick, relentless waves, blinding her vision. She pulled the hood of the coat tighter around her face, bracing herself as she forced her weight forward. She had no idea where Caleb had gone, but she followed the only sign she had, his footprints. They were already half covered by fresh snow, but she could still make out the faint indentations leading away from the cabin, disappearing into the dense tree line beyond. She swallowed hard. Think, Eleanor. Be smart about this. Her breath puffed out in frantic, misty clouds as she trudged forward, every step sinking into the thick snow. Her legs burned from the effort. The boots were heavy, awkward on her feet, but she pushed on. The trees loomed around her, their branches heavy with ice, creaking in the wind. The world was eerily quiet beneath the roar of the storm, the muffled sound of snowfall making everything feel wrong. Then she heard it. A low, sharp grunt. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, straining to listen. Another sound, this time, a deep growl. Not Caleb. Her pulse spiked as she turned her head, scanning the thick snowfall for any sign of movement. Then she saw him. Caleb stood just beyond a break in the trees, his body tense, his posture rigid. And just a few feet in front of him, a massive wolf stood in the snow, muscles coiled, eyes locked onto Caleb, like a predator sizing up its prey. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The animal was huge, bigger than any wolf she had ever seen. Its thick coat was covered in fresh snow, its breath fogging up the frigid air in slow, steady puffs. Caleb wasn't moving. Neither was the wolf. A standoff. Eleanor's fingers curled into the coat, her instincts screaming at her to do something. But what? She had no weapons, no way to scare the wolf off. But Caleb wasn't panicking. He knew what he was doing. She forced herself to stay still, watching. Slowly, Caleb shifted his stance, his movements deliberate, measured. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't lunge. He simply stood his ground. And then he growled. Deep, low. The sound sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. The wolf's ears flattened slightly, its body tensing, but it didn't advance. Caleb took a slow step forward. The wolf hesitated. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the massive animal let out a sharp puff, turned, and disappeared into the trees. Silence. Eleanor let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Caleb stood motionless for another second, watching the spot where the wolf had vanished. Then, finally, he let his shoulders relax and turned, his sharp gray eyes locking onto her. "What the hell are you doing out here?" His voice was low, rough. Eleanor swallowed hard. I heard something. I thought." "You thought what?" He strode toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. "That you'd come out in the middle of a blizzard, completely unarmed, wearing boots that don't even fit, and rescue me." His tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't cruel. But there was something else there. Something furious. Something scared. Eleanor lifted her chin. "I wasn't going to just sit inside and do nothing." Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his snow-damp hair. "Damn it, Eleanor." For a long moment, they just stood there, both breathing hard, the cold pressing in from all sides. Then, without warning, he reached for her. His fingers curled around her wrist. Not rough, not forceful, but warm, grounding. "Come on," he muttered, pulling her forward. "Before you freeze to death." Eleanor let him lead her back toward the cabin, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know why the sight of him standing there, facing off with a damn wolf, had made something tighten in her chest. All she knew was this: Caleb Mercer wasn't just some mountain man. And whatever was between them, it was getting harder and harder to ignore. Fire and ice. The cabin door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the howling wind outside. The warmth inside should have been comforting, a stark contrast to the freezing world beyond. But Eleanor was still shivering, not from the cold, but from the sheer adrenaline surging through her veins. She barely had time to yank off the oversized boots before Caleb spun on her, his storm gray eyes burning with something she couldn't quite name. "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was low, but there was heat in it, simmering just beneath the surface, barely contained. Eleanor clenched her fists, still breathless. "I wasn't just going to sit here while you were out there." "Yes, you were." He cut her off, his tone edged with frustration. "That was the one thing I told you to do. Stay inside." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I don't take orders from you." Caleb exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his damp hair. He looked furious. But beneath that anger, there was something else, something raw. "You could have been hurt," he said, quieter now. "Or worse." Eleanor swallowed. The way he said it made something tighten in her chest. "I wasn't trying to be reckless," she muttered. Caleb let out a humorless laugh. "No, because walking into a blizzard with no idea what's out there seems pretty damn reckless to me." Eleanor folded her arms, trying to keep her voice steady. "I heard a noise. I thought it could have been you. I thought something happened." Caleb's expression flickered, just for a second. And there it was. Beneath all that frustration, beneath the anger and exasperation, was fear. Not for himself. For her. Eleanor's breath caught. They stood there, staring at each other, the fire crackling between them. The tension was thick, a charged energy neither of them knew how to handle. Caleb was still breathing hard, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. as if he was trying to get himself under control. Eleanor had seen that kind of restraint before, not in a man like Caleb, not in someone who lived alone in the mountains, who seemed utterly untouchable. She had seen it in herself, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the moments right before she tore someone's world apart with nothing but a signature on a contract. Except this wasn't business. This was personal. And that terrified her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away. It doesn't matter. We're both fine. Caleb let out another slow breath, as if forcing himself to let it go. Next time, he muttered, turning toward the fireplace, just stay inside. Eleanor clenched her teeth. She hated being told what to do. She hated feeling powerless. But the truth was, she had been scared too. The thought of something happening to him, a complete stranger, shouldn't have made her chest tighten the way it had. And yet it did. Unspoken truths. Eleanor sat on the couch, absently running her fingers over the fabric of the thick blanket draped over her lap. Caleb was by the fireplace, tending to the flames, his movements controlled and methodical. The room was too quiet. For the first time since she had arrived, neither of them had anything sarcastic to say. She sipped at the tea she had made earlier, but it had gone cold. So she set it aside and forced herself to speak. "That wolf," she said, breaking the silence. "You weren't scared of it." Caleb didn't look at her. "Should I have been?" Eleanor frowned. "Most people would be." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I know these woods." She studied him. "You knew exactly what to do. You didn't run. You didn't even flinch. It was like you were talking to it." Caleb finally glanced at her, his eyes unreadable. "You don't show fear in front of a predator." Eleanor shivered slightly, not from the cold. Something about the way he said it unnerved her. Like he wasn't just talking about the wolf. Like he had faced something worse. She hesitated. "Have you done that before?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the fireplace, crossing his arms over his chest, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I used to be a firefighter." Eleanor blinked. That was not the answer she had expected. She sat up straighter. "Seriously?" Caleb nodded, still not looking at her. 12 years. Eleanor's mind raced, trying to picture it. Him, young, in uniform, walking into burning buildings without hesitation. Something clicked into place. It explained the way he moved, with quiet efficiency, always calculating. It explained why he never panicked, but it didn't explain why he left. Eleanor swallowed. What happened? For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Then, finally, "There was a fire," he said, his voice quieter now. "An apartment building. A little girl, 4 years old, was trapped inside." Eleanor's breath caught. She already knew how this ended. Caleb exhaled, running a hand over his jaw. "I got to her, had her in my arms, but the building collapsed before we made it out." Eleanor felt a sharp pang in her chest. She didn't make it. His voice was too calm, too controlled. Eleanor knew what that meant. She had built a career around reading people, knowing when they were lying, when they were holding something back. And Caleb Mercer was holding back everything. She swallowed, her throat suddenly tight. "That wasn't your fault." Caleb finally looked at her. Something in his gaze made her stomach twist, because he didn't believe her. Eleanor exhaled softly. "Is that why you left?" Caleb hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, "Yes." Eleanor didn't know what to say. She had been expecting something else, something simpler. But this was guilt, a weight he had been carrying for years. She shifted slightly, gripping the edge of the blanket. "You think leaving changed anything?" Caleb let out a slow, tired breath. "I think it was the only choice I had left." Silence. Eleanor stared at him, realizing something she hadn't before. She had been running too. Not from fire, not from death, but from betrayal. From the life she had built, the empire she had created, only to watch it turn to ash. They were different, but they were the same. She inhaled deeply, her heart pounding. Caleb must have felt the shift in the air too, because his gaze locked onto hers. Something between them snapped tight. Tension. Real. Palpable. Caleb exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. This shouldn't have happened. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Right, she said, forcing a small, humorless laugh. Of course. But neither of them moved. Neither of them broke the moment. Because they both knew. Whatever was happening between them. It was too late to stop it now. A line crossed. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with its warm glow, but the tension between them had nothing to do with warmth. It was something else. Something heavier, something neither of them could ignore. Eleanor sat stiffly on the couch, still gripping the blanket like it was a lifeline. Caleb stood near the fireplace, his shoulders tense, his jaw set, like he was preparing for a battle he knew he couldn't win. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. He had told her something real, something that mattered. And now he was trying to take it back. This shouldn't have happened, he had said. Eleanor forced herself to breathe evenly, pushing down the sharp ache in her chest. So that's it, she asked, her voice quieter than before. You let me in for a second, and now you're just shutting me out again. Caleb exhaled through his nose, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. He didn't look at her when he spoke. This isn't your problem, Eleanor. She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. You really think that, don't you? That if you just push hard enough, people will stop caring. Caleb finally looked at her then, his gray eyes flickering with something unreadable. You don't even know me. Eleanor felt something snap inside her. You saved my life, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You pulled me out of that wreck, dragged me through a blizzard, and made sure I didn't freeze to death. You made me tea when I woke up, even though you pretended it didn't mean anything. You? She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. You sat there and told me something real, Caleb. Something that hurt you. Don't tell me I don't know anything about you. The words hung between them, charged, electric. Caleb's throat worked as he swallowed. He shifted slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides, like he wanted to say something, wanted to close the distance between them, but was fighting it with everything he had. Eleanor didn't move. She just waited. And then, he turned away. Her stomach plummeted. The sharp pain in her chest twisted, turned into something angry, not just at him, but at herself. She had let herself believe, just for a second, that maybe, he would stop running. But she had been wrong. She shook her head, standing abruptly. The blanket slid off her shoulders, pooling at her feet. Forget it, she muttered. Caleb tensed. Eleanor. No, she cut him off, her voice harder now. I get it. You don't want to let anyone in. You want to be alone, stuck out here with your guilt, pretending like that makes it better. She let out a breathless, humorless laugh. You win, Mercer. I won't try to fix you. She turned sharply, heading toward the small guest room in the back of the cabin, her hands trembling at her sides. She didn't slam the door, but she wanted to. The line blurs. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, her fingers curled into the blanket draped over her lap. She hated feeling like this. Raw. Exposed. Like she had made a mistake by caring at all. She pressed her palm against her forehead, taking a deep breath. Tomorrow, the storm would clear. Tomorrow, she could leave. That was the plan, right? So why did the thought of walking out of this cabin feel so wrong? A soft creak from the main room made her stiffen. Footsteps. Slow, hesitant. And then, a knock at the door. Eleanor's heart lurched. She clenched her jaw. Go away, Caleb. Silence. She expected him to leave, to walk away, just like he had earlier. But then his voice came, rough and low, too quiet. I'm not good at this. Eleanor swallowed, gripping the blanket tighter. She didn't respond. Caleb exhaled, like he was forcing himself to keep talking. I left because I thought it was the only way to live with it, he said. The guilt, the nightmares, the weight of it all. A pause. And for a long time, I thought I was right. Eleanor stared at the door, her pulse thudding. But you, he hesitated. You make me wonder if I was wrong. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she stood, her feet bare against the wooden floor. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. This was a line, a moment that could change everything. She could walk away, or she could open the door. The choice was hers. Her fingers curled around the handle. And she turned it. The door swung open, revealing Caleb standing there, his expression tight, his jaw clenched like he was forcing himself not to run. They stared at each other. Neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, without hesitating, Eleanor stepped forward, and Caleb pulled her in. His arms wrapped around her, strong and unyielding, holding her against him like he needed to, like he had been fighting it for far too long. Eleanor's breath caught. She should have felt awkward. She should have felt hesitant. But she didn't. She just melted into him. Because for the first time in days, maybe even years, she didn't feel alone. And neither did he. Caleb exhaled against her hair, his hands firm against her back, his grip just a little too tight, like he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. Eleanor closed her eyes. She didn't know what this was. But she knew one thing. She wasn't leaving tomorrow. The walls come down. The wind had died sometime in the night, but the silence left in its wake was almost louder than the storm itself. The fire had burned low in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows along the wooden walls of the cabin. But Eleanor barely noticed any of it. She was still in Caleb's arms. She didn't know how long they had stood there like that. Seconds, minutes, maybe longer. Neither of them had spoken. Neither of them had moved, as if breaking the moment would shatter something too fragile to rebuild. His body was warm against hers, solid and steady. His grip was firm, not possessive, not demanding, just there, holding her like he wasn't sure if he should, but he couldn't let go. And she let him. For once in her life, she didn't analyze, didn't calculate, didn't try to predict what came next. She just felt. But reality, cold and unforgiving, was never far behind. Slowly, reluctantly, Caleb exhaled against her hair and loosened his hold. He didn't step away, but his hands drifted from her back to her arms, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary before he finally, let go. Eleanor took a breath, stepping back. The space between them was small, too small. Her heart was still racing, her skin still tingling with the warmth of where he had touched her. She glanced up at him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something dark and conflicted. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. This, he started, but then stopped, his jaw tightening. Eleanor crossed her arms. Don't say it shouldn't have happened. Caleb looked at her then, his gaze sharp, intense. You think it should have? Eleanor hesitated. I think. She swallowed. I think it did, and I think we both need to stop pretending it didn't. Silence. Caleb didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, finally, he let out a dry, humorless chuckle. You don't quit, do you? Eleanor tilted her chin up. No, I don't. His lips twitched, almost a smirk, almost something. But then, just as quickly, his expression darkened again. This is a mistake, he muttered. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Why? Caleb exhaled sharply. Because you don't belong here, Eleanor. The words should have stung. They should have felt like a slap, a reminder that this was temporary, that whatever this was, whatever they were, wouldn't last past the morning. But instead, Eleanor just laughed. A soft, breathless, almost disbelieving laugh. Caleb frowned. What's funny? She shook her head. You keep saying that. That I don't belong here. She met his gaze, something defiant burning behind her eyes. But have you ever stopped to think that maybe I don't belong anywhere else either? Caleb's expression flickered, just for a second. And in that second, Eleanor saw it. That same recognition she had felt earlier. That same understanding. Because they were different, yes. But they were the same. Two people running from the wreckage of their pasts, hiding in different ways. Him, in the wilderness. Her, in the world. Caleb exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, like he was trying to physically push away the truth of what she had just said. But Eleanor had already seen it, and he knew it. Finally, he sighed. Come on, he muttered, turning toward the fire. You need to sleep. Eleanor arched a brow. And you don't. Caleb smirked, but it was faint, tired. I'm used to not sleeping. Eleanor studied him, the exhaustion evident in the tightness of his shoulders, the way his hands flexed at his sides. Nightmares? She asked softly. Caleb didn't answer right away, but he didn't need to. He just sat down in the chair by the fire, stretching his legs out in front of him, staring into the flames. Eleanor hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed the spare blanket from the couch and draped it over his lap. Caleb looked up at her, brows raised. She shrugged. Just because you're used to something doesn't mean it's good for you. Something unreadable passed over his face. Then, softer this time. Good night, Eleanor. She nodded, turning toward the small bedroom. But just before she stepped inside, she heard him murmur, so quiet she almost missed it. Thank you. And for the first time since she had crashed into his world, she finally felt safe. Morning comes. Eleanor woke to silence. Not the kind of silence that had filled the cabin before, the heavy, suffocating kind, but something lighter, something different. She sat up slowly, stretching, the soreness in her muscles a reminder that everything that had happened last night had been real. She glanced toward the door, hesitating before pushing it open. The cabin was empty. Panic flared in her chest for half a second before she noticed the fire was already restoked, fresh logs burning steadily. Caleb was still here. She just had to find him. Pulling on her coat, she stepped outside onto the porch. The storm had passed. The world was pristine, untouched white stretching out in every direction, the trees bending under the weight of fresh snow, the sky a soft, clear blue. And there, just beyond the cabin, was Caleb, chopping wood. Eleanor's breath caught slightly as she watched him, the way his muscles flexed beneath the worn thermal shirt he wore, the controlled precision of each swing of the axe, the easy, almost methodical rhythm he worked in. But it wasn't just the sight of him that made her pause. It was the peace on his face. For the first time since she had met him, he didn't look weighed down by his past. Didn't look like he was running. And that terrified her more than anything. Because if Caleb Mercer stopped running, what would that mean for them? Crossing the line. Eleanor swallowed, stepping off the porch, her boots sinking slightly into the snow as she made her way toward him. Caleb looked up at the sound, setting the axe down as she approached. You're up early, he commented. Eleanor smirked. You look surprised. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. You don't strike me as a morning person. She shrugged. Maybe I'm full of surprises. Caleb exhaled, glancing toward the cabin. Coffee's inside. Eleanor arched a brow. You made coffee? He smirked. I make good coffee. She huffed. I'll be the judge of that. Caleb chuckled. And it was real. Genuine. Eleanor's heart skipped. Just once. Just enough to make her stomach tighten, her fingers curl slightly at her sides. Because this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a moment that would fade once the snow melted and the roads cleared. This was something else. And she had no idea what to do about it. So instead, she smirked, crossing her arms. I bet I can chop better than you. Caleb arched a brow. Oh, she grinned. Yeah, give me the axe. He hesitated. Then, slowly, he handed it to her. Their fingers brushed, and in that single, fleeting touch, Eleanor knew she wasn't leaving. Not today. Maybe not ever. No way back. The moment Eleanor gripped the axe, she knew she had made a mistake. It was heavier than she expected, the rough wooden handle cold against her fingers. But Caleb was watching, arms crossed, that infuriating half-smirk tugging at his lips, like he knew exactly what was about to happen. She lifted it, adjusted her stance, and swung. The blade struck the log at an odd angle, barely splitting the wood before the axe lodged itself deep into the stump. Silence. Then, a low chuckle. Eleanor clenched her jaw, glancing up to find Caleb shaking his head, looking far too entertained by her failure. "Oh, shut up," she muttered, bracing her boot against the stump as she tried to yank the axe free. Caleb took a slow step forward, and before she could protest, he reached out, placing his hand over hers. A shiver shot through her, not from the cold. "You're holding it wrong," he murmured. She swallowed hard. "Am I?" Caleb smirked again, but this time there was something different about it. He shifted behind her, his chest just barely brushing against her back. His hands adjusted hers, his fingers rough and calloused over her softer skin. "Grip it lower," he said, his voice lower now, more gravelly. "Let the weight do the work. You're trying too hard." Eleanor barely heard him. Because this was dangerous. Not the axe. Not the woods. Him. Caleb Mercer, the man who had saved her life, the man who had held her in his arms like she was something breakable and then pushed her away like he was the one who would shatter first. Eleanor had spent her whole life controlling everything. Her career, her relationships, her emotions. But Caleb was the first person who had made her feel completely out of control. She cleared her throat, trying to ignore how close he was. "You gonna let me try again? Or are you just gonna stand there all day, mountain man?" Caleb huffed out a quiet laugh, stepping back. "Go on," he said. "Impress me." Eleanor exhaled, squared her shoulders, and lifted the axe. This time, when she swung, the blade sank clean through the log, splitting it in two with a satisfying crack. She grinned, turning to Caleb with her hands on her hips. "Told you I could do it." Caleb studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he nodded once. "Not bad." Eleanor tilted her head. "Not bad." His smirk deepened. "I mean, you still looked ridiculous doing it. But yeah, not bad." She rolled her eyes, tossing the axe down. "You really are insufferable, you know that." Caleb just chuckled, shaking his head as he turned back toward the cabin. "Come on," he called over his shoulder, "before your city girl hands start blistering." Eleanor huffed but followed him inside. The space between them. The cabin was warmer than before, the fire burning strong again. The scent of coffee and wood smoke filled the air, a stark contrast to the icy wind outside. Caleb poured 2 mugs without asking if she wanted one and set one in front of her on the worn wooden table. Eleanor wrapped her hands around it, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Not awkward, not forced, just quiet. Caleb leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His face was less guarded now. The usual tension in his shoulders slightly eased. And Eleanor felt it, the thing neither of them wanted to say. This was more than a temporary arrangement. This was more than the storm. And now that the roads were clearing, now that she could leave. She didn't want to. Her grip tightened around the mug. She should leave. She should go back to New York, back to the life she had built, back to whatever mess was waiting for her. But the thought made her chest ache. She glanced at Caleb. "You ever think about going back?" He didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, "No." Eleanor frowned. "Not even once." Caleb exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Back to what? A city that never let me breathe. A job that took more than it gave. He shook his head. I had nothing there, Eleanor. His voice was firm, final. Eleanor's stomach twisted, because for the first time she wondered, did she have anything to go back to? She swallowed, staring into her coffee. Do you? Caleb asked suddenly. Eleanor's head snapped up. Do I what? He met her gaze, something searching in his expression. Have anything to go back to? Her breath hitched. She could lie. Could pretend she still had a life, a future in New York. But Caleb would know. He always knew. She let out a slow, shaky breath. I thought I did. His jaw tightened. Your husband. She scoffed, shaking her head. Ex-husband. As soon as I get the papers signed. Caleb's gaze flickered with something unreadable. And your company? Eleanor hesitated. Before, she would have said it was everything. Now, she didn't know. It's complicated, she admitted. I built it from nothing. I should fight for it. But, Caleb leaned forward slightly. But, Eleanor exhaled. But I don't know if I care anymore. The words were honest. Too honest. And they terrified her. Because if she didn't have that, if she didn't have her career, her success, then who was she? Silence settled between them again, heavier this time. And then, softly, you could stay. Eleanor's breath caught. Her pulse stuttered. She stared at him, her mind racing. What? Caleb held her gaze. You could stay. His voice was steady, certain. Not forever. Just for a while. Eleanor's heart pounded. Every rational thought in her head screamed no. She didn't belong here. She wasn't built for this life. But then she looked at Caleb, really looked at him. The way he was watching her, not pushing, not forcing, just offering. And something inside her cracked. Because for the first time in years, she wanted to stay. Not because she had to. Not because she had nowhere else to go. But because she wanted to. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. I don't even know how to survive out here. Caleb smirked. I'll teach you. Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head. You really think I can just live in the mountains and chop wood like some kind of frontier woman? Caleb leaned back, that smirk still playing on his lips. Well, you're already better at chopping than I expected. Eleanor laughed. A real, genuine laugh. And when she looked at him again, something shifted. Something final. Because in that moment, she knew. She wasn't going back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of that.